Hello there, you're most welcome to join me on my YouTube today. We're taking a look at the Supermarine Spitfire Prototype, which first flew in 1936, and we're also taking a look at the replica Spitfire that was built by the Spitfire Society back in the early 1990s, and also we're going to take a look at the replica Spitfire that Clive Du Cros built, which was completely built from timber. He used a Jaguar car engine in it, and I think it generally is a really interesting story. So stick around, pin your ears back. I think you'll find it worthwhile hanging in there.
In the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.
These are the first pictures ever to be taken of some of Britain's new hush-hush fighting machines.
Wherever you go in the world, you talk about aeroplanes and the Second World War, everyone talks about Spitfires all the time. The Germans, the Japanese, everybody.
The Spitfire was the brainchild of Reginald Mitchell from the Supermarine Aviation Works in Wroughton. He adapted it from a seaplane design of his, which was winning air races. It proved to be an outstanding fighter aircraft when the Battle of Britain came along in 1940.
It was a big step to go from wooden structures with bits of string holding the wings together to an all-metal airplane with a huge great engine on the front, capable of 340 odd miles an hour.
These are the first pictures ever to be taken of some of Britain's new hush-hush fighting machines.
This is the first Spitfire at Eastleigh in 1936. At the controls was Captain Mutt Summers. Many of the pilots who followed him flew in anger, including Jimmy Corbin from Maidstone, who logged 2,000 hours in the cockpit during World War II.
I wouldn't say it was the easy aircraft to fly to start off with. It was when you got more confidence and more experience. It was a wonderful aircraft, and I loved it.
The Spitfire was the brainchild of Reginald Mitchell from the Supermarine Aviation Works in Wroughton. He adapted it from a seaplane design of his, which was winning air races. It proved to be an outstanding fighter aircraft when the Battle of Britain came along in 1940. Over 22,500 Spitfires came off the production line not just at Wroughton, but in factories all over the country, including one at Rochester Airport and another at Gravesend, where Barry Dines was an apprentice.
The Spitfire tanks were assembled on a jig, and they were built similar to a ship's hull. You had the ribs which you bolted on, and my job, being a welder's mate, was to guide the skin onto the rib whilst the welder did the welding job.
Few people realise how great the Spitfire's contribution was throughout the entire course of the war.
It came into its own after the Battle of Britain, when it was used for air-sea rescue, it was used for bombing, and they made up to Mark 24 of the Spitfire. The last squadron flying it went in 1960.
The iconic aircraft, though, will always be associated with those few short weeks in 1940, when it saw off the threat of invasion.
Those of us that lived through were bloody lucky. It was due to two experiences: luck or good piloting, and a combination of both.
And the Spitfire?
Yeah.
Now, back in 1984, a group of people got together and decided that they wanted to reproduce a non-flying replica of the prototype Spitfire K5054. And a group of quite illustrious people got together, headed up by Geoffrey Quill, Alex Henshaw, Dr. Gordon Mitchell, the son of R.J. Mitchell, Jerry Jingle, Jack Davis, Viv Bunting and David Green. Now the cost of this replica, non-flying replica, was estimated at £60,000, and work began to reproduce the prototype. And interestingly, the cockpit was built by Clive Du Cros, who went on to build his own replica prototype Spitfire in timber, which flew quite successfully for a couple of flights, and the project came together, and by 1994 the Spitfire prototype was complete. Now it lived at Southampton for a short while, and then eventually it found a home at Tangmere Military Museum, where it resides today. In this section of the film, we're taking a look at the wooden replica. This was a flying aircraft that Clive Du Cros built. He started back in the mid-1980s, and sort of by the mid-1990s it was flying. It had a Jaguar car engine in it, and it flew quite successfully for a short time, but unfortunately, even with the skills of Pete Thorne, it eventually did have a bit of a sticky end, so check it out.
22,000 that were built during the war were assembled in Swindon, and today's anniversary celebrations reminded us that a full-sized Spitfire is being built there now, not by Vickers or any aircraft company, but by a young man who's fascinated by this particular aeroplane. Clive Du Cros runs a taxi firm by night, and by day, with two helpers, he's turning a dream into reality. John Norman brings us up to date.
The Spitfire's success as an aeroplane and a fighter made it world famous. It became a symbol of Britain's defiance during the war. The very first Spitfire flew in 1936, a thoroughbred which had its origins in pre-war air races. It was this prototype, number 5054, which Clive Du Cros decided to copy, but in wood rather than metal. And he'd got this far when we first met him just over a year ago. The full-size wooden version had been specially designed for him, and at this stage it looked remarkably like a huge model. Now he's well on the way to completion.
Pete Thorne, the test pilot from the Battle of Britain Memorial Fund, flying Clive Du Cros' wooden replica Spitfire with a Jaguar engine. Now, it did have several successful flights, but the engine continued to give them problems, and Pete Thorne was bringing it to Wroughton to one of the air shows, and unfortunately the undercarriage, the right-hand undercarriage collapsed, which set them back a bit. But they did get it flying again, but the engine problems continued to they continued to hamper the progress of the aircraft, and unfortunately, eventually Pete Thorne had to put it down in a wheels-up crash landing, and that was pretty much the end of it. But the aircraft the aircraft stayed around, and it's now, unfortunately, it was taken. Well, very sadly, the wings were trimmed off, and the fuselage now lives at the Battle of Britain Museum in Kent. But and they have got the engine running in recent years. But it was a very sad end. But for it to fly again, it would need a completely new wing. But nevertheless, it was an enterprising project by Clive Du Cros, and it did actually fly. So we have to take hat off to all his hard work.
Preparations for a huge air show in the West. The plane, an exact copy of the fighter which helped to defeat the Luftwaffe, had taken a Swindon enthusiast 11 years to build, but the pilot, who was a member of the Battle of Britain display team, escaped serious injury.
The aircraft which crashed today had been flown in from Hallavington, where its owner, taxi fleet operator Clive Du Cros, had been completing building work in an old RAF hangar. It was the plane's 10th flight. During other sorties, there'd been trouble with the Jaguar car engine, which powers the replica fighter. Today, the homemade Spitfire was delayed in reaching the Wroughton airfield a few miles away because of yet more engine problems. But worse was to come. As the highly experienced Battle of Britain display pilot Pete Thorne brought the plane in for what looked like a perfect landing, things went terribly wrong. Little did he realize his starboard wheel had not locked into position. On touching down, the wheel collapsed and the speeding plane slewed across the runway onto the grass. Fire crews were quickly on the scene, aware that the aircraft was topped up with fuel, which was now leaking out. Medical teams were on hand to check on the condition of the pilot, who was walking around surveying the damage. Obviously the undercarriage gave way. Yep. You then took a decision to come onto the grass?
No decision at all.
It took you that way, did it?
I was taken.
When were you aware there was trouble?
As the undercarriage collapsed?
Just as it collapsed?
Yes.
The undercarriage had been damaged together with the propeller. The owner, who'd been following in another plane, was upset and refused to talk about the incident, which had soured his first effort to display the Spitfire. It's since been jacked up and moved into a hangar.
Which is the hangars and other parked aircraft. When this aircraft was engaged in the Battle of Britain a few weeks later, the refuelling and rearming would be a good deal less measured and leisurely. After topping up the 84-gallon fuel tanks, the Spitfire is manhandled into a hangar. In 1940, operational fighters would have been serviced on the airfield, only going into the hangars for major work. A number of skilled tradesmen are needed even for a daily inspection. They're all RAF servicemen, and at this early stage of the war, probably regulars who'd been trained on biplanes. An airframe rigger tests the wheel brakes, which are operated by compressed air at 200 pounds per square inch. The fabric-covered tail control surfaces, the rudder and elevators, which the rigger tests for full, free and correct movement. The ailerons, too, are checked. It was not unknown for these vital controls to be connected in reverse after major overhaul. The rigger is operating the elevator trim wheel. This secondary flight control moves small trim tabs on the elevator, which enable the pilot to adjust for hands-off flight, compensating for nose or tail heaviness as the power changes.
The rudder bar is moved to the limit of its travel and the bias is checked. The Spitfire 1's landing flaps, like the brakes, are operated by compressed air and can only be either fully down or up. The wheels are normally retracted by hydraulic power from an engine-driven pump, but this lever releases an emergency supply of carbon dioxide to the undercarriage. The radio on early Spitfires was tuned mechanically by a cable linkage from this control box. This Spitfire is fitted with the TR9 HF radio, which was standard throughout the Battle of Britain. Many TR9s were fitted with pipsqueak, an automatic timer which switched on the transmitter for 14 seconds in each minute to enable DF stations to track individual aircraft. HF radio was to remain in service until late in 1940, when a VHF set, the TR1143, was issued. The next tradesman to appear is the instrument mechanic. A pilot's life depended on his instruments. The mechanic adjusts the zero of the Spitfire's rate of climb indicator. Although calibrated to 4,000 feet per minute, Spitfire 1's best climb was 2,500 feet per minute. The altimeter is set to QFE, the local barometric pressure, to read zero on that airfield on that day. The central standard blind flying panel, common to all RAF aircraft, is mounted on anti-vibration springs. The undercarriage warning horn is tested. This blows automatically if aircraft attempt to land with wheels up. The ethylene glycol coolant tank is checked, as is the pilot's oxygen supply. The total oxygen and rate of supply being constantly metered. Once oxygen became a standard fitting, it didn't take long for aircrew to discover that a few deep breaths of it were an instant cure for a hangover. The mechanic checks the time, adjusts the clock, and winds it. The 5.8-gallon oil tank is topped up. Another airman cleans and checks the undercarriage well. When this film was shot just before the Battle of Britain, the reflector sight was still top secret. The instrument mechanic tests the brightness control of the internal lamp on which the sight depended. 3 spare bulbs are carried in the cockpit. The Spitfire 1 had a control to enable the pilot to lower landing lights fitted under each wing. These powerful lights could also be moved up and down by the pilot. This refinement disappeared on later marks, since Spitfires proved unsuitable for night fighting. The fitter ensures that the fuel filler cap is secure. Next, the fuel gauges for the 2 internal tanks. One contained 48, the other 37 imperial gallons. The airman then checks and cleans the engine radiator intake. In the cockpit, an airframe rigger operates the shutter which controls the radiator temperature. The Form 700 is signed. The daily inspection is complete. This Spitfire bears the code of number 609, West Riding Squadron. 609 to be heavily engaged in the Battle of Britain, based at Middle Wallop and Warmwell. This unique film was shot in early June 1940 at number 6 Maintenance Unit, Rise Norton. The Spitfire is pushed past a parked Miles Master trainer and an early Hurricane onto the large grass airfield. The light weight, 5,820 pounds, of the Spitfire 1 is evident from the easy way the 5-man handling crew turned the aircraft into wind for an engine run-up. The Spitfire required 2,400 rounds of 303-inch ammunition for its 8 Browning guns. Belts are made up with either armour-piercing, incendiary or ball ammunition. The last 25 rounds were usually tracer to warn the pilot he was running out. Each gun had a 300-round belt, which was loaded into a box magazine. As soon as the fighters landed after action, as soon as the propellers stopped turning, the ground crews were at work. While the aircraft refueled, beneath the wings, the armourers are removing the spent magazines from their stowage. Then they clean the barrels with the traditional 4 by 2-inch patch of flannelette, leaving the guns clean, bright and slightly oiled. The oxygen bottles, too, are changed by the armourers. Fresh 300-round ammunition magazines are brought to the aircraft. Using a length of webbing, the belts are fed through the gun breeches. This simple device enabled the armourers to rearm a Spitfire in less than 10 minutes, instead of the original 20, since they no longer had to remove the 8 access panels on the upper surfaces of the wings. The guns are cocked and the access panels replaced using the patent fastening. As any ex-armourer or rigger will recall, not all panels went back as easily as this one. The Spitfire is now armed and ready to fight.
Found this of some interest, and we'll just finish up with a look at the very last mark of Spitfire that flew with the RAF mainly in photo reconnaissance, almost right up until 1960. And this is the Griffin engine, the Spitfire, of absolutely awesome power and speed. Well, I hope you really did enjoy it, and consider subscribing to my channel. Would really appreciate that. All the very best for now. Take care. Cheers.